Hi everyone, welcome to this month's Real English episode. In these videos I'm taking you around the city of Edinburgh, telling you about its history and giving you a great English lesson at the same time. So in today's video we are going to be talking about this guy, Sir Walter Scott. Let's go. Scott actually started his literary career as an antiquarian, but after reading a book of ballads from the Scottish borders, he became inspired to write his own poetry. He wrote long narrative poems, and the purpose of them was not to enlighten, but to entertain, which made them hugely successful. His first poem saw unprecedented sales and made him a celebrity overnight. It mentioned Melrose Abbey in the Scottish borders, and this place quickly became a hot tourist spot. His second poem was based around Loch Katrine in the Trossachs, and this actually started a tourist boom in the area that would continue up till this day. That poem, The Lady of the Lake, broke all sales records, and he didn't have any competition really in these long narrative poems until the poet Byron came along. When he saw that Byron was starting to outsell him, he decided to have a new literary challenge, and that's where he decided to test his abilities at writing a novel. That might not seem like a big thing these days, but at the time it was a huge risk to his literary career. The novel was seen as something for women, a trivial piece of literature that wasn't really proper writing. What Scott did was he masculinized it and made it cool. And he is widely credited with inventing the historical novel. You really don't need to go far in Edinburgh to find the influence of Walter Scott. We even named our railway station Edinburgh Waverley after one of his most famous novels, Waverley, or 'Tis Been 60 Years Since. Walter Scott chose significant moments in Scotland's history as the basis for his historical novels, such as the Covenanters, the Union of the Crowns, and in the case of the novel Waverley, the Jacobite Rebellion. The way that Scott approached these moments in our history would have mammoth implications for the culture of Scotland. The main thing was that instead of making these differences political as they had been during history, he made them cultural. He recorded Scottish traditions but often edited them, and he also made sure to celebrate the outcomes of things like the Act of Union and the consequences that came from the Battle of Culloden. He essentially created a new tradition of Scotland. While his books celebrated the Highlands, they also encouraged the reader to see them as history, although very often that history was invented by Scott himself. You really can't emphasise enough how popular Scott was. He was called the Magician of the North. At a time when the average print run for a novel was 750, the Waverley novels alone were doing print runs of 6,000 to 10,000. Walter Scott also had some very famous fans. Queen Victoria loved his writing, and the then Prince of Wales and future George IV was also a huge fan of his work. Scott actually published anonymously or through pseudonyms until 1827. However, the Prince of Wales demanded to find out who this writer was. He got his name and invited him for dinner, and this would be the start of a very important friendship when it came to Scotland's identity and culture. So why was he so popular? Well, when Scott was writing, it was happening at the same time as the industrialisation of Britain. The romantic, wild and empty landscapes of the Highlands would have been a welcome relief from the crowded industrial Victorian cities. Of course, there was an irony to this. The emptiness of the Highlands drew crowds, but no one really stopped to ask why they were empty. This was also happening simultaneously with the Highland clearances, where people were being moved off their land to make space for more profitable farming, such as sheep farming. So while Scott's a really famous writer, arguably his most important contribution to Scotland has actually been seeing how the world, and quite often we see ourselves. He was the one who managed to find the lost honours of Scotland, or the crown jewels of Scotland, that had been hidden in Edinburgh Castle for centuries. And this helped give the country a real sense of pride in its identity, which hasn't gone away. Scott was an ardent unionist. He was really proud of his Scottish heritage, but believed in the union of the crowns between Scotland and England, and also their political union too. He saw that a lot of people were looking at the unrest that was happening in America and France, and felt the same way about a corrupt government that was governing the country of Britain. And he was worried that if action wasn't taken, something similar would happen in Scotland. In order to create this connection between Scotland and George IV, He persuaded the king that he was actually a Jacobean king because of the Stuart dynasty in his lines that were the original kings of Scotland. He suggested that King George IV should come and do a Scottish royal visit. It would be the first visit to Scotland by a monarch in over 200 years. The irony of this, of course, was that the celebration of this King George coming to Scotland would actually be celebrating the culture that his grandfather had sought to eradicate through the Battle of Culloden and the measures that were put in place afterwards. The Highland culture that had been deemed far too dangerous for the British state was brought out in full pageantry. King George was absolutely delighted with the idea, and he commissioned himself a Highland outfit, which is being a little bit creative with the definition there. The outfit cost the equivalent of £120,000 in today's money. A new tartan was created to celebrate this called the Royal Stuart tartan. Extremely impractical if you consider the original use of tartan, which was to blend in with the vegetation, to allow yourself to go hunting, seeing as the Royal Stuart tartan is right. Not only this, King George looked fairly ridiculous. His kilt was far too short and he had to wear pink coloured pantaloons underneath it to avoid showing too much of his legs. Scott set about organising the event with a lot of gusto. He got special sets designed to look like the Highlands for the dances. He got all of the gentry to make sure that they had their own traditional Highland outfits. This resulted in a rush in trying to buy them because they didn't exist, and he set up 2 weeks of events for the king, which included what we now consider traditional Scottish events such as Highland dancing, traditional music, bagpipes, and of course, wearing tartan. From this point, tartan became one of the most popular materials around. The image that Walter Scott created for King George on this visit would become the enduring image of Scotland. You'll still find it on every shortbread tin in tourist shops around the country. It's the one of the romantic Highlander in the wild, empty wilderness of the north of Scotland in the Highlands. Even the traditional Highland outfit that was created for King George's visit is still used commonly today when we have celebrations such as weddings. In the 20th century, this popular view of Walter Scott began to be re-examined. A lot of people felt that he was wrong to essentially rewrite Scottish history and rewrite Scottish traditions. Not only that, there was a much more socialist perspective in terms of politics applied to his belief systems and his work. There's no doubt that that image that Scott created of Scotland sells. It's extremely popular to this day. You'll see it in shows such as Outlander, and it still brings a lot of tourism to Scotland and boosts our economy. On the other hand, Scotland is a modern nation and we're changing. Perhaps it's time for us to move away from this idea of the romantic Highlander running away over the hills. Walter Scott's views about the Union are also coming into question, given the issue of Scottish independence. While the 2014 referendum resulted in a no vote, the question still hasn't gone away. On a personal level, I don't really enjoy Walter Scott's writing, but I have to say he's a fascinating historical figure, and there is absolutely no denying that Scotland would be a very different country today if he hadn't been around. But perhaps the more important question is it okay for one person to have such a huge influence on the identity of a country? I'll let you guys decide that one. Chose significant moments in Scotland's history as the basis for his historical novels, such as The Covenanters, The Union of the Crowns, and in the case of the novel Waverley, the Jacobite Rebellion. So while Scott's a really famous writer, arguably his most important contribution to Scotland has actually been seeing how the world, and quite often we see ourselves. In order to create this connection between Scotland and George IV, he persuaded the king that he was actually a Jacobean. being as the royal Stuart tartan is bright red. Not only this, King George looked fairly ridiculous. There's no doubt that that image that Scott created of Scotland sells. And boosts our economy. On the other hand, Scotland is a modern nation. On a personal level, I don't really enjoy Walter Scott's writing, but I have to say he's a fascinating historical figure. Thanks so much for watching our video today. Please remember to subscribe so that you never miss one, and we'll see you for our next Real English